everybody, it's Rebecca, your teen and tween librarian, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Before we get started with a slightly extra long episode today, just a quick run over of what happened in the last chapter. Irene finally found her great big old huge grandmother again. I love those descriptions. And she got to, be healed by her, which was very sweet, but get to spend the night with her grandmother. I thought that was such a sweet chapter. It reminded me of early mornings after spending the night at my grandmother's house and eating buttery toast and drinking orange juice and smelling her strong coffee and just talking about our lives. And it also reminded me a time of with my other grandmother, spending the night at her house, and my sister and I each getting to have a night where we got to spend it in our grandmother's bed. And she had this huge big screen TV and all the Disney movies on VHS. Kids, VHS is a thing that your parents used to watch movies on when they were small children. You might have to Google it. Anyway, but that was the big deal, is that we got to sleep in that bed with her, and then we got to pick whichever movie we wanted to watch, and we'd watch it, and usually I think she'd just fall asleep right away, so you're sitting up watching this movie by yourself, which was pretty cool at the time. So I loved this chapter. It just reminded me of all the times I got to spend with my grandmothers, and I hope you guys had some good memories pop up too. That's something to think about. Do you have loving, warm memories of spending time with just your grandmother? If so, that would be definitely a good story to write down. Well, let's get started. Tonight we'll be doing chapters 12 and 13 because both of them are somewhat shorter, so we can squish them together. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 12. A short chapter about Curdie. Wonder how long it's going to be. Oh boy. Curdie spent many nights in the mine. His father and he had taken Mrs. Peterson into the secret, for they knew Mother could hold her tongue, which is more than could be said of all the miners' wives. But Curdie did not tell her that every night he spent in the mine, part of it went into earning a new red petticoat for her. Mrs. Peterson was such a nice, good mother. All mothers are nice and good, more or less. But Mrs. Peterson was nice and good, all more and no less. She made and kept a little heaven in that poor cottage on the high hillside, for her husband and son to go home to out of the low and rather dreary earth in which they worked. I doubt if the princess was very much happier, even in the arms of her huge great-grandmother, than Peter and Curdie were in the arms of Mrs. Peterson. True, her hands were hard and chapped and large, but it was with work for them, and therefore in the sight of the angels, her hands were so much the more beautiful. And if Curdie worked hard to get her a petticoat, she worked hard every day to get him comforts, which he would have missed much more than she would a new petticoat even in winter. Not that she and Curdie ever thought of how much they worked for each other. That would have spoiled everything. When left alone in the mine, Curdie always worked on for an hour or two at first, following the lode which, according to Glump, would lead at last into the deserted habitation. After that, he would set out on a reconnoitering expedition. In order to manage this, or rather to return from it, better than the first time, he had bought a huge ball of fine string, having learned the trick from Hop-o'-my-Thumb, whose history his mother had often told him. Not that Hop-o'-my-Thumb had ever used a ball of string. I should be sorry to be so supposed far out of my classics, but the principle was the same as that of pebbles. The end of this string he fastened to his pickaxe, which figured no bad anchor, and then, with the ball in his hand, unrolling it as he went, set out in the dark through the natural gangs of the goblins' territory. The first night or two he came upon nothing worth remembering. He saw only a little of the home life the Cobs in the various caves they called houses, failed in coming upon anything to cast light upon the foregoing design which kept the inundation for the present in the background. But at length, I think on the third or fourth night, he found, partly guided by the noise of their implements, a company of evidently the best sappers and miners amongst them, hard at work. What were they about? It could not be, well, the inundation, seeing as how that had in the meantime been postponed to something else. Then what was it? He lurked and watched, every now and then in the greatest risk of being detected, but without success. He had again and again to retreat in haste, a proceeding rendered the more difficult that he had to gather up his string as he returned upon its course. It was not that he was afraid of the goblins, but that he was afraid of their finding out that they were watched, which might have prevented the discovery at which he aimed. Sometimes his haste had to be such that, when he reached home towards morning, his string, for lack of time to wind it up as he dodged the Cobs, would be in what seemed the most hopeless entanglement. But after a good sleep, though a short one, he always found his mother had got it right again. There it was, wound in a most respectable ball, ready for use the moment he should want it. "I can't think how you do it, Mother," he would say. "I follow the thread," she would answer, "just as you do in the mine." She never had more to say about it, but the less clever she was with her words, the more clever she was with her hands, and the less his mother said, the more Curdie believed she had to say. But still, he had made no discovery as to what the goblin miners were about. And that's the end to a very short chapter about Curdie. Chapter 13. The Cobs' Creatures. About this time, the gentlemen whom the king had left behind him to watch over the princess had each occasion to doubt the testimony of his own eyes, for more than strange were the objects to which they would bear witness. They were one sort, creatures, but so grotesque and misshapen as to be more like a child's drawings upon his slate than anything natural. They saw them only at night, while on guard about the house. The testimony of the man who first reported having seen one of them was that, as he was walking slowly round the house, while yet in the shadow, he caught sight of a creature standing on its hind legs in the moonlight, with its 4 feet upon a window ledge, staring in at the window. Its body might have been that of a dog or wolf, he thought, but he declared on his honor that its head was twice the size it ought to have been for the size of its body, and as round as a ball, while the face, which it turned upon him as it fled, was more like one carved by a boy upon the turnip inside which he was going to put a candle than anything else he could think of. It rushed into the garden. He sent an arrow after it, and he thought he must have struck it, for it gave an unearthly howl, and he could not find his arrow any more than the beast, although he searched all about the place where it vanished. They laughed at him until he was driven to hold his tongue, and he said he must have taken too long a pull at the ale jug. But before 2 nights were over, he had one to side with him, for he, too, had seen something strange, only quite different from that reported by the other. The description the second man gave of the creature he had seen was yet more grotesque and unlikely. They were both laughed at by the rest, but night after night another came over to their side, until at last there was only one left to laugh at all his companions. 2 nights more passed, and he saw nothing. But on the third he came rushing from the garden to the other 2 before the house, in such an agitation that they declared, for it was their turn now, that the band of his helmet was cracking under his chin, with the rising of his hair inside it. Running with him into that part of the garden which I have already described, they saw a score of creatures, to not one of which they could give a name, and not one of which was like another, hideous and ludicrous at once, gambolling on the lawn in the moonlight. The supernatural, or rather subnatural ugliness of their faces, the length of legs and necks in some, the apparent absence of both or either in others, made the spectators, although in one consent as to what they saw, yet doubtful, as I have said, of the evidence of their own eyes and ears as well. For the noises they made, although not loud, were as uncouth and varied in their forms, and could be described neither as grunts, nor squeaks, nor roars, nor howls, nor barks, nor yells, nor screams, nor croaks, nor hisses, nor mews, nor shrieks, but only as something like all of them mingled in one horrible dissonance. Keeping in the shade, the watchers had a few moments to recover themselves before the hideous assembly suspected their presence. But all at once, as if by common consent, they scampered off in the direction of a great rock and vanished before the men had come to themselves sufficiently to think of following them. My readers will suspect what these were, but I will now give them full information concerning them. They were, of course, household animals belonging to the goblins, whose ancestors had taken their ancestors many centuries before from the upper regions of light into the lower regions of darkness. The original stocks of these horrible creatures were very much the same as the animals now seen about farms and homes in the country, with the exception of a few of them which had been wild creatures, such as foxes, and indeed wolves and small bears, which the goblins, from their proclivity towards the animal creation, had caught when cubs and tamed. But in the course of time all had undergone even greater changes than had passed upon their owners. They had altered, that is, their descendants had altered, into such creatures as I have not attempted to describe except in the vaguest manner, the various parts of their bodies assuming, in an apparently arbitrary and self-willed manner, the most abnormal developments. Indeed, so little did any distinct type predominate in some of the bewildering results that you could only have guessed at any known animal as the original. And even then, what likeness remained that could be more of one of general expression than of definable conformation? But what increased the gruesomeness tenfold was that from constant domestic, or indeed rather family association with the goblins, their countenances had grown in grotesque resemblance to the human. No one understands animals who does not see that every one of them, even amongst the fishes, it may be with a dimness and vagueness infinitely remote, yet shadows the human. In the case of these, the human resemblance had greatly increased. While their owners had sunk toward them, they had risen toward their owners. But the conditions of subterranean life being equally unnatural for both, while the goblins were worse, the creatures had not improved by the approximation, and its result would have appeared far more ludicrous than consoling to the warmest lover of animal nature. I shall now explain how it was that just then these animals began to show themselves about the king's country house. The goblins, as Curdie had discovered, were mining, at work both day and night, in divisions urging the scheme after which he lay in wait. In the course of their tunneling, they had broken into the channel of a small stream, but the break being on the top of it, no water had escaped to interfere with their work. Some of the creatures, hovering as they often did about their masters, had found the hole and had, with the curiosity which had grown to a passion from the restraints of their unnatural circumstances, proceeded to explore the channel. The stream was the same which ran out by the seat on which Irene and her king papa had sat, as I have told, and the goblin creatures found it jolly fun to get out for a romp on a smooth lawn just as they had never seen in all their poor, miserable lives. But although they had partaken enough of the nature of their owners in delight in annoying and alarming any of the people whom they had met on the mountain, they were, of course, incapable of designs of their own, or of intentionally furthering those of their masters. For several nights, after the men-at-arms were at length of one mind as to the fact of the visits of some horrible creatures, whether whether bodily or spectral they could not yet say, they watched with special attention that part of the garden where they had last seen them. Perhaps, indeed, they gave in consequence too little attention to the house. But the creatures were too cunning to be easily caught, nor were the watchers quick-eyed enough to descry the head or the keen eyes in it, which, from the opening whence the stream issued, would watch them in turn, ready, the moment they should leave the lawn, to report the place clear. That's the end of chapter 13. Thank you for joining me for another installment of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what else is happening with the library by finding us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always visit the library's website. I hope you'll join me for another episode, but until then, be well and sleep well.